What's up guys, my name is Joe and we're back with another episode of British Guy Reacts, and we are back reacting to another Lost in the Pond video with Lawrence. This one is 7 myths British people believe about America part 1. So we're going to see if I believe any of these myths that Lawrence tells us about today. If you are new around here, subscribe to the channel, give the video a like, comment down below on things you want me to react to in the future. We're going to jump straight in. Let's go.
I'm Lawrence Brown and I'm on
Got better camera quality these days. I always react to his old videos.
quest to uncover all of the memos that Britain and America lost in the pond, and one of those memos pertains to myths. Specifically, myths that British people, including myself at one point, believed about the United States of America. But it is amazing what 14 years of living in the United States will do to your understanding and your perceptions about this very country. For instance, I learned early on that they don't have Cornish pasties, and I learned slightly less earlier on, so later, that Michigan has them. But I don't live in Michigan, so one way or another I still have to have them imported. A quick reminder that if you're not subscribed to this channel, you can change that fact about your life right now. But these myths go way beyond the absence of quintessentially British food. And so now that I've lived here for about a seventh of a century, it's time to outline some of the myths that us British believe about America and Americans.
Everyone lives in a giant house. I would believe that your houses in general are bigger than ours, and I would assume a large percentage of the population lives in a giant house. Not a giant house, but a big house. But obviously you've still got like working class people, obviously, and some poor people, unfortunately, who definitely I wouldn't assume live in a giant house. So kind of true,
this is a
though,
funny
I
one,
would say.
because I think television gives us this notion that Americans do all live in giant houses like the McAllisters do in Home Alone, but it's not entirely the case. Sure, I mean, statistically, American houses are on average larger than their UK counterparts. There are a number of reasons for this, which I outlined in this video. But to say that all Americans live in really large houses is a complete fabrication of anything resembling the truth. And I was a good example of this before I became a YouTube sensation, because when I first moved to Chicago, we had to do things on a budget.
I love it when he calls himself a YouTube sensation. You are, Lawrence, you are.
Between me and my wife, we weren't making a great income, and this is a major city, so we had to sort of settle for an apartment whose dimensions were 300 square feet. And for those of you who don't know, that's about the size of a shoebox, roughly. You know, we had to leave our shoes outside the door. That's how small it was. And it is worth reiterating, I think, that the cost of living in the United States does fluctuate massively across the country. When I lived in Indiana, just one state over, we were paying about $530 a month. That's basically unheard of in Chicago. And it's certainly unheard of in New York City, which of course was the city in which the show Friends is set. And I think it's shows like that that gave us this impression that Americans were all living in big apartments.
Each street has thousands of houses. Nah, I disagree with that, because I would have more gone with the fact that you have big houses, so there'd be less houses on a street, if that makes sense, because we normally see it as like detached houses rather than terraced houses, so I wouldn't believe this one.
And speaking of houses, I was alerted to a tweet recently from a British person who couldn't believe that American addresses go way up into the thousands, and their belief on this was that every street in the United States has thousands of houses on it. And this was a belief that I used to have, because the country is absolutely massive, so you almost expect it to have to house that many people. But the thing is, there are way fewer people in this country per square mile than there are in Britain, so it doesn't add up. And that's when I got looking into it, and in a previous video I outlined it doesn't really work like that. On any given street, they don't start at the number 1 and then end at 10,000. Often, and it's the case here in Chicago, you'll usually have a string of houses, for example, all in the 6,000s on a given street, and that's because it's about 6 miles from the center of downtown. 1 mile in from that, they're all 5,000s. Another mile, they're all 4,000s, etc., etc.
Okay.
Now, not every city in the US
not a bad
is
system.
from the center of the city. It could be from another part of the city or just some other central point. But that's sort of a general rule for how the numbering works on US houses. This one comes up again and again, that the United States is such a young country.
I would have, before I started this YouTube channel, I would have questioned the amount of history that the US does have, because it is a younger country. But since we've checked out some of the historical facts about the US and stuff on this channel, then now I know better than that,
That it
obviously.
basically doesn't have a history. And I've always thought of this perception of America to be quite a lazy one. Because even if you go back to 1776 through to the present day, yes, it is a short amount of time in comparison to the history of Britain, but think about all of the insane things that happened in that period. And even if you ignore all that, there's one thing that we tend to forget because we don't get taught it very deeply in Britain, and that is the thousands of years of native history that happened before we even turned up. I was absolutely blown away, not literally, that would be weird, when I went to Cahokia Mounds here in Illinois. Many, many hundreds of years ago, Cahokia Mounds used to be a native city, and it had about 20,000 people, which might not sound like a lot by both American and British standards, but back in the day, that was more than London.
Okay, the next one, the US and Canada are basically the same. Yeah, I guess in a way, we'd assume that the people are very similar and the standard of living and stuff is pretty much the same. We would also have the concept that Canadians are friendlier than Americans. But yeah, I kind of go with that one. I'm guessing it's not true, but we'd kind of go with that.
This one is embarrassing for me because years ago I believed that Canada and the United States were basically the same country. And the reason that I believe that is, number one, I was 12, so cut me some slack. And number two, my only sort of exposure to both countries was through the people, was through the way they spoke. And to my young ears, which couldn't yet differentiate these two accents, Macho Man Randy Savage and Bret Hart basically had the same accent, just with an entirely different timbre. And that's all I had to go on. And I think it's what a lot of British people have to go on, because I still occasionally see those comments. Oh, what is the difference between Canada and America? Or is it essentially that one has Mounties and the other doesn't? And it's only since I moved here that I've become super aware of the substantial difference between the two countries. Completely different healthcare systems, completely different food, completely different use of English. Right, in Britain we call it the loo, in America they call it a restroom, in Canada they call it a washroom. And I've seen all manner of different examples of that kind of thing. In America they don't celebrate Boxing Day, in Canada they do. The Canadian dollar is different to the American dollar. In some ways they go with British English in places that America doesn't. And now that I'm older and I've listened to some of the regionalisms throughout the United States, even the way Americans speak is different to how Canadians speak. I'm not an expert on that, so I'm not going to go into too much detail, but these differences certainly go way beyond how the two countries pronounce the word about.
Americans allowed. Yeah, I'd probably would go with that one and believe that one. The Americans that I have met have tended to be louder than British people in general, especially if you're in like a restaurant setting or like a public place. Americans don't seem to have such a problem with being loud and talking out loud, and like British people are kind of more reserved and shy in that way. I guess in a restaurant we'd not be quiet, we'd obviously be talking, but more at a lower volume than we would do at home, maybe, I guess. So I would kind of believe that myth in a way. Just in comparison to British people, though, not like that they're overly loud, just in comparison to us.
I've touched on this before, but I couldn't really do a video without including it in this list. This perception that Americans are loud and boisterous. And I can understand on some level where that comes from, because I think the way Americans speak, it comes from a different part of the throat. So it's a bit more projected, right? Whereas us Brits, it's more sort of, I don't know, understated a lot of the time. I think another reason that we think Americans are loud is how they present themselves in films. There might even have been a time in my life where I thought all Americans were loud just because Jim Carrey was. He's Canadian, isn't he? He is Canadian. And culturally
I did not know Jim Carrey was Canadian.
speaking, I definitely have found that Americans speak at a higher volume when they're in restaurants together, but there are so many other examples of the opposite being true. On match day, after we've had a pint or six, you know, we're singing the songs of our team who we love because they happen to be situated in the town that we were born in. And it's just what we do when we leave a nightclub, which, you know, I haven't done in 20 years. But when we did, you know, I'd be on the street yelling at traffic cones, because that might have just been me. But what I'm saying is, when we get drunk, we very much give Americans a run for their money. There's a loud person in all of us, right? And once we free ourselves of our inhibitions, we can let out all of the decibels we want. That's not a call to action. It's merely an observation.
Americans all walk around in fanny packs. No, I wouldn't assume that. Definitely wouldn't assume that. I know Joe Rogan does, and I know he's a big advocate for men using them. But I wouldn't believe it because I see the amount of grief he gets given on his podcast for wearing one. So no, False. Wouldn't believe.
This is only funny, not because of the image of Americans walking around with bomb bags on, but it's because we call them bomb bags and
we
you
do
call
them
them
bomb
fanny
bags.
packs, and it's bloody hilarious. It is also partly the visual, because bomb bags have never been cool, but this notion, which I occasionally read, that Americans are just always walking around wearing one is very laughable, especially as somebody who's lived here 14 years. So it's quite dumbfounding, this one. I'm not saying that all British people think this way, but the ones that do, I'd be very interested to hear, do they think that way because they met an American in 1994 and they've just held on to that belief? Or are American tourists still wearing bomb bags? Do people carry cash? But I don't. I can tell you this, I don't have a bomb bag / fanny pack radar, right? I am not constantly surveilling the populace to see whether they do or do not have a fanny pack. But my feeling is I don't remember seeing one in a while. So I think this is one very time-specific stereotype that can now be laid to rest, all right?
Americans don't say autumn. Yeah, you say fall, don't you? That's what I would assume. You say fall.
And yes, I thought I'd include one that was quite topical, not just because we are in the autumn, but also because I mentioned this fact on my YouTube short yesterday. Now, while for reasons that were laid out in that YouTube short, Americans prefer the term fall, I was surprised to find that the word autumn was pretty common among Americans. I don't know if this is a recent thing, like the whole country just woke up one morning and watched Lost in the Pond and thought to themselves, yes, we're changing things now. Or if it's just sort of always been here as an alternative to fall. And you might be thinking, ooh, Lawrence, aren't there many surprising word alternatives that Americans use that Brits don't know about? And the answer to that is yes. I merely brought this one up so I could make that very point. This is undoubtedly a pandemic era thing, but I've seen an increasing number of Americans using the word jab to mean shot. I once worked with an American colleague who liked to use the word bonkers. So in part because of the internet, just as Britain is taking on quite a few Americanisms, I think the same is true in reverse, and it will be very interesting to look further into those details. And those are just a handful of myths that some Brits believe about America and Americans. Let me know in the comments some of the myths that you've had to dispel.
Okay guys, so that is the end of the video. I hope you did enjoy it. Go and subscribe to the Lost in the Pond channel. We do react to quite a few of their videos, so go and show some love. Let me know down below if there's any other myths or if what you think about these myths stated in the video. Give the video a like, subscribe to the channel, and I'll see you for the next one. Take it easy. Peace.